and welcome to today's Race and Redemption Conversation. I'm Bill Amore, lead pastor of Calvary Fellowship, and we have begun this series of conversations because we know that the world is dealing with a lot of different difficult issues regarding race, racism, ethnicity, complex issues. And so it's our desire to approach these topics rather than shy away from them and come from a biblical lens, from a Christian worldview, and have some difficult but necessary and hopefully healing conversations. And each time we do, again, these are conversations, but we hope that it brings in more people to talk about these things and then to see what God would lead us to do in terms of implementing into action and how we can be a positive force for change in our world. So today I want to introduce you, first of all, to my co-host and then the guests that are going to be on this episode. So first, my co-host, Jalith, introduce yourself.
Hey everybody, my name is Jalith Gary and I am the Assistant Worship Leader at Calvary Fellowship. I've been at Calvary for 8 years and love hosting and co-hosting the Race and Redemption series with PB. So I hope that you get a lot out of this conversation. I'm excited to hear what Fernie and Kenneth have to say.
Great, thank you. And speaking of that, let's introduce our guests. Fernie.
Hi, my name is Fernie Cosgrive. I am the director of our Calvary Kids Ministry here at Calvary Fellowship, and I'm also a social worker. I am super excited to be part of this conversation as I was born in El Paso, Texas, to Mexican parents, and I was actually raised in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico until I was 15 to then move to the US. So I'm excited to be able to join and be part of this conversation today.
And Kenneth.
And Kenneth, I'm a Mexican American from San Antonio, Texas. I'm very excited to be here today. I'm very grateful to Calvary Fellowship for hosting this important conversation. I lived in Connecticut for about a year, where I'm an assistant professor in residence in the Department of Sociology at the University of Connecticut. Thank you all for watching and valuing this conversation as I do. It already makes me feel good that I'm a part of a church that cares about this.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. And I think that's a great way to say something. So it's been a few weeks since we last held these conversations. And really it was a process of, it isn't a lack of interest or concern or passion. We're taking the long view with this. And so we've kind of pivoted from doing a weekly thing to trying to figure out how frequently it'll be, whether it's once, twice a month. But the goal is ongoing until we don't need to have these conversations anymore. So who knows when that will be, by the grace of God, right? But for now, we're going to kind of keep going and having these conversations in a redemptive way. And so far, the first few conversations we've had been talking about issues as African Americans, and what does that look like with people who are white, and what are some of the complexities of and it's not like we've exhausted that topic. We're going to come back to that, but today we're going to talk about, because there's lots of different ethnicities. You know, one of the things I love is God created the nations. He created that's not something that just evolved. He purposely created different people in different forms, all expressing his beauty and the imago Dei, the image of God. And just like we can't see the image of God only in a man or only in a woman, but in both, we don't see the image of God just in one ethnicity, but in this this collection of ethnicities. And so today, and we know that within each ethnicity, there's Bible teaches, science teaches, there's one race, so it's not like all different races, but there are different ethnicities, and we know this, and there are different complexities. And one of the issues, or one of the groups of people that experience lots of issues are Latin Americans, particularly as we're talking about today, Mexican Americans, and there's so many things that we could talk about. But what I'd love for us to start with is, let's talk about a little bit of terminology. So I know that Fernie and Kenneth, you are both Mexican Americans, so that makes it easy, but we have lots of different, even in our church, people of different Latino, Hispanic origin, and and I know it grew having spent a lot of time in South Florida, lots of Cuban folks, South American, and we've got various ethnicities in our church too. But what I'd love for us to start with is let's talk about terminology. So, because when we talk about these issues, there's so many complexities and sensitivities, and I think terminology is even important. So, what do you prefer? And I know, again, as we talked to Jalith, not one person speaks for an entire ethnicity. So this is your perspective, your experience based on your life. But when we talk about terminologies, you both identified yourself as Mexican American, which we understand in the broader group, Hispanic, Latino, appropriate, not preferred. And I know that one of, even when we talked, Kenneth, when we were talking about Latinx is somewhat of a newer term that's come up that you're not the biggest fan. So I'd love for you, rather than me to define, you to help speak into that a little bit, if you don't mind, for us.
You want to go first, Fernie, or? Okay, so I use the term Mexican American, and I'm certainly not incredibly dogmatic about it. If somebody calls me Latino, if somebody calls me Hispanic, I'm not going to be remotely upset about it. Hispanic, as I understand, has some historians will tell you has a political history to it, so it's not something that I'm particularly attracted to. Also, the terms Hispanic and Latino, Latina, Latin American have heavy overlap with minor differences, so it tends to be confusing for most people. So for me, I have a national ethnic identifier, and it's simple. I am not particularly a fan of the word Latinx. I typically hear this promoted by white Americans who have an issue, who well-intended in some regards, right? That the Spanish language is gendered, and if you default to O for male, it may make it feel as if maleness is the natural, while female is excluded. And I understand where the concern is coming from. On the other hand, there is a sensitivity in being a person of color and having white people say your language is being done incorrectly. So I do certainly think there are issues of gender inequality that need to be dealt with in Mexican American culture and in Mexican culture back home. But I would appreciate that we lead on that. And actually, within the past couple of years, there was a poll that came out from a progressive organization that found 2% of us really prefer that term. So again, if you call me Latinx, I'm not going to be mad, I'm not going to be offended, but that's kind of the rationale behind how I use this terminology.
I appreciate that, Kenneth, and that's super insightful. Fernie, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I actually identify myself just as Mexican. And I think part of it, like when I describe myself, I never say I'm Mexican American, for the simple fact that even though I was born in the US, I was raised in Mexico until I was 15. Like English was always my second language. That we're taking as kind of classes in school. It wasn't that I was raised in the US until much later in my life. So I really had that migration history of having a time to where my primary residence 24/7 was in Mexico, to moving and having to basically uproot all of my life to come to the US, adapt to US culture, adapt to speaking the language, and really adapt to basically everything that the US brings. I was talking with my sister about this the other day, and she told me, she's like, you're probably more Mexican American than you realize, just because I think of the way that like maybe like I've assimilated to the American culture to where I am more American than Mexican. I always joke that I've been a bad Mexican because I'm not like, I don't love just, I don't know, rancheritas or certain type of music. I can't really dance salsa. And that's just been something that's been there since way before I moved. So I've always, been called a little bit more white. So I guess that's kind of my definition on Mexican American and being Mexican. So that's something that I'm also kind of thinking about. I agree with Kenneth in the sense that I think when you talk about Latinos, you're really talking about people that, live from Mexico down, and South America. So it's kind of a combination of all of us. It doesn't really portray what our identity or what our cultural heritage is. It's just like, it's all of us together. And then Hispanic, I think it can be a little confusing because sometimes Spaniards from Spain are included in Hispanic because they're Spanish speaking. I think for me, the only, like, the term that really kind of gets to me is when people say I'm Spanish, because I'm not my language. I have a culture, and like, I am Mexican. So I think sometimes people maybe will say like, oh, you're Spanish. And I'm like, no, I speak Spanish. I am Mexican. And I think with that, the term Latinx, that's kind of how it feels for me. It's like, you don't want to take the time to understand what our culture is, and you don't want to understand where we're coming from. So you're just going to call us Latinx and kind of like put it all together, when, you know, you're not really taking into consideration like country of origin, the fact that there's many different dialects and different versions of Spanish. There's times where I'm speaking with Dominicans and I cannot understand what they're saying. We're both speaking Spanish, but I cannot understand because of the differences in the language.
That's great, and that's super insightful. Jalith, any thoughts before? I know we have some thoughts we want to get into today, but I don't want to leave you out of this.
No, I'm happy to listen and chime in as necessary.
Awesome.
Like I
Well,
said, so
I appreciate both Fernie and Kenneth, because we're hearing from female perspective, also a male perspective, but also how cool is it that we're hearing from a Mexican American who was born in the United States, but has history with Mexico, but also a Mexican who might consider herself sometimes a Mexican American, but who was born here but grew up for 15 years in Mexico. So you guys are going to bring some different flavors and different perspectives as we talk. And I appreciate the terminology, because I think for many people, we might say something like Latino or Hispanic, or even Latinx or Spanish, and might be well-intentioned but ignorant in the best sense of the words, and just don't know. So you guys even beginning a conversation with that is helpful. And so for today in this space, and I recognize, again, not to alienate people in our church that are of different nationalities and that have different conversations, like you mentioned, South America and others, and within that the continents that have different countries of origin and different cultures and so forth. But today we're talking to Mexican Americans. And so that's kind of the lens that we're going to look through today. So I appreciate you guys speaking to that. And speaking of that, you know, Kenneth, when you and I had a preliminary conversation, what I'd love to lead off with is one of the questions, and I'll just repeat what you asked when I asked you, like, hey, what are some things that you think would be helpful to talk about? And I'd love to hear from both you and Fernie, that as we look at right now, conversations about racism, ethnicity are blowing up. We're having them all over, whether people want to have them or not. But as you've looked on, one of the questions that you said that we're considering, and again, from your perspective as a Mexican American, is where do we fit in right now to all the conversations that are going on? And would you mind expanding that thought and that question a little bit and unpacking that? And then Fernie, of course, feel free to jump in.
Sure. So I was thinking about, the origins of the conversation we're having here at Calvary Fellowship, and how this was in response to, police shootings very much affecting the African American community, and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter protests, which again have been around for a while, but a resurgence in them in response to this, and how the Black Lives Matter as a movement, and also the organization, but as a movement that we talk more about here, from its very origins was expansive, right? And this is not just limited to Black Lives Matter, but like I teach Dr. Martin Luther King every semester to my students. I work him in somehow. We published in a sociology journal once, so we adopt him as one of our own in the discipline. But he also spoke, that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And you see this line of reasoning in the, and it predates him, but you see this line of reasoning in the Black Lives Matter movement. You hear it in the chants back guess it was 2013, 2014. And I was watching live footage of the protests in Baltimore, which really got this recent wave started. And I was interested and impressed at how many Native Americans happened to be there. I just saw lots of Native Americans being interviewed, and there was this, pan solidarity. And you see the BIPOC or BIPOC abbreviation that's coming out of this, referring to, expansive to all people of color who would benefit from this as well. And so I know that we do have a place in this because Black Lives Matter has always been intentional about this, as of other civil rights oriented movements, and that allyship is really important. On the other hand, in some of the political and activist circles I'm involved with, that I won't get into too much detail about right now, but they were talking about foreign policy. So they were talking about, okay, well, this is an appreciation of how non-white lives matter, and that when people say all lives matter, well, no, they actually don't until Black lives matter, until everyone's lives matter. So that is a false statement as we see it. And so people were responding, okay, well, what about Yemeni lives, right? Where there's a coalition of Western and Middle Eastern governments engaging in what some have considered a genocidal policy in Yemen, right? And so it was responded, well, hashtag Yemeni lives matter, and hashtag Somali lives matter, and et cetera, et cetera. Afghanistan lives matter. And there was some pushback that said, okay, well, this is a Black Lives Matter moment. So let's also not lose our focus here, and let's recognize, okay, well, we're about to push for some police reforms, right? So I don't want to cut in line and say, well, right as you're about to get potentially some police reforms passed, then I say, well, what about DACA? Well, what about immigration? Well, what about Dreamers? And then the task gets derailed. I don't want to make, I want to appreciate the expanded efforts to include everybody while not turning Mexican American activism or other forms of activism into an all lives matter moment. So I don't have hard conclusions there. I have two goals that I think are really important. One is to honor the focus of the Black Lives Matter movement, and also to be appreciative of where we fit in. But it is a discussion point more for me than it is something that I've reached a hard conclusion on.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because I think sometimes every time we have a conversation about race, I think we need to have a conversation about how we influence, right? And how are we bringing our own kind of baggage into it? And I think it's important that kind of as we have this conversation, just really understanding what do we as individuals bring into it, right? Because I think it doesn't matter what race or what ethnicity you identify with, there's going to be a racial bias and a prejudgment against races that you don't understand, So I think we need to be part of this conversation, because as Mexicans and as Latinos, we're not exempt from being racist against our African American, brothers and sisters. And I think sometimes that kind of baffles my mind, because I have family members, that are very fair skinned and they have very light color in their skin. And then I have other cousins that are very dark colored, but we all have the same grandparents, or we think, but at the end of the day, I think we need to be a part of this conversation, not only to say that, yeah, there needs to be immigration reform as well. There needs to be changes in DACA, and there needs to be all of these things. But we also need to be able to understand right now, how do we contribute to the current racism that African Americans are experiencing, and not really kind of like you said, not derailing from that, because I think these conversations are not going to stop until everyone, we are seen as one, and until we are able to appreciate our differences, both, in Hispanic culture, in African American culture, and Asian cultures, and every single culture brings their racism and their racial into it, and kind of being able to address that is important, and taking responsibility for what we bring into the pot, while also kind of advocating for who we are.
So Fernie brought up something that I thought was really important, and I had kind of forgotten to mention, but it came up in the kind of preliminary conversations we were having, and that's kind of balancing this recognition that not drawing a false distinction, that there are some commonalities, right? That of being non-white in America, where it's very obvious where the reforms being encouraged by the Black Lives Matter movement would affect us. But also, when one group of people has a historical legacy of forced migration into the United States for the purposes of slavery, and the other one has either we were part of our land. If you're from where I'm from, we were here all along, but then we were colonized. For another group of us, we're trying to migrate, but there's resistance to us coming to the country, which is a very different legacy than forced migration. At the same time, there's some commonalities in regard to just discrimination that comes out of that. And so there's things that we have in common, but as Fernie said, I mean, being from San Antonio, actually after Hurricane Katrina, which devastated minority neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods particularly, and NOLA, San Antonio actually had, I'm embarrassed to say, one of the worst responses to the resettling internally displaced peoples in Texas. Houston, Dallas, and some other areas anecdotally, and I believe some sociologists have looked into this, were far more receptive, because there were some unfortunate hostilities between Mexican Americans and Black Americans. So I think Fernie is absolutely right to say that, there are issues that we need to deal with as an in-house issue as well.
I think this is helpful to bring up because, again, just broadening out for a moment, I think that we've all recognized, we've talked about before, there are big systemic things that we need to look at and say what needs to change. At the same time, and not losing sight of or making one or the other, there's heart issues inside each and every one of us. There's biases, there's prejudices that we need to examine and look at what God is doing with us. And even within cultures that you've just brought out, that could be the place. And Fernie, you even mentioned something about, hey, in my own family, there's various tones of skin. And one of the things that you mentioned to me that was fascinating is that even your husband, Stephen, to bring up, who is also a Mexican American, but lighter complexion, has experienced even some racism from, do you mind speaking to that a little bit?
Yeah, so my husband, he is a Mexican American. His dad is Caucasian and his mom's Mexican, born and raised in Mexico. She became, a U.S. resident when she married my father-in-law. But my husband, if you've seen him, he is 6'5". He is white looking, has very light skin. Unless he's tanned, then he looks more Mexican. But when he was young, he had trouble picking up English. So Spanish was his first language. And back in the day, therapists were like, okay, you're not going to speak Spanish, focus only on English, which I think kind of really started a whole area of things, because being a son of Mexican mother and a Mexican father that didn't speak Spanish, that was kind of really alienating for him from his family. And even when we got married, all my family's Mexican. So it's like, why are you marrying a white dude that doesn't speak your language, And to this day, there are a lot of things, kind of like cultural barriers and language barriers that we have to kind of face, because it's hard for my mom that only speaks Spanish to communicate with my husband that primarily speaks English, and kind of like, he's learned a lot of Spanish through time, but I see that difference even with my cousin who married a Mexican American who only speaks English. Now he speaks more Spanish, but he has a more like a darker complexion, so he looks more Mexican. And the reaction between my husband and her husband was very different, just for how both of them looked. So that's definitely something that, it's close to my heart that we've had to work through with our family, and I mean, my husband listens to more Mexican music than I do. So.
Nice. Well, you see, this is, and I appreciate you sharing that. And all of the issues we've discussed so far are why we're having these conversations, because it's not just stuff we read about in the news, but it impacts our friendships, our families, how we connect with one another, how we relate to one another, ideally, scripturally, how that should be, and then the gap that's between there. So obviously we've got a lot of work to do as a country, but also as nation, other nations and cultures, and as individual people. So I appreciate you guys both speaking to that. And Kenneth, you had said, back to the broader question of where do we, and then particularly as Mexican Americans, fit into this conversation? And one of the ways that you phrased it is kind of where is this cultural moment now? What's and count for us, or where are we in this? And you've given a great example, like, hey, it's not a as opposed to my African American brothers or sisters, but kind of like what's our place, what's our role in this? So, and I know you haven't. It sounds like, hey, oh, I've got this firm and hard conclusion, but any additional thoughts on that, on kind of where either of you kind of where you've landed and say, hey, this is what I see. And again, I know this. You mentioned we talked about immigration. We brushed up against that, and that could be a whole conversation here. In fact, I think what we've all agreed on is we're going to have a future episode just focusing on that, because there's so much wrapped in that, and we could have a rich conversation. So we may brush up against it today, but we're not going to get as in depth in it as the future. But yeah, back to that question, Kenneth. Any further thoughts on kind of, hey, what's our path for right now? What's our place for right now?
I mean, I guess in general, I know that this is a salient moment. And so I was like scheduled to teach a course on race, class, and gender in the summer, and 2 sections. The first one didn't fill, and then in fact, it got canceled. The second one, it started filling very quickly, after the protest started, and students all said, I wanted to learn about this. And our church and other churches are hosting conversations about this. And there are social media campaigns, and it's being brought up in music and Hollywood. And so we know it is a time in our country where we are encouraged to talk about injustice. And I cannot think of a greater gift, to the church, that we have it. We have a bad history in some areas, but we also have a good history on leading in these areas as well. We have a culture that is looking for answers, that is looking for healing in ways that are deeply spiritual, that are deeply moral. I mean, if you're like me, you sometimes find yourself, feeling guilty that you haven't, shared the gospel, talked about the Lord with someone in a while, and you ask for God, give me an opportunity, and you go out, and the next day, and nobody approached you for no reason and told me, can you please give me 10 reasons why I should accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior? Well, I don't know why my prayers aren't getting answered. But lots of people are eager to talk about the soul of our nation right now. And so I think it's a great opportunity for the church. It is an important opportunity for us as people of color broadly. And I would migrate, from the awareness, of the soul of the nation and of the individual, but also it is a moment where we are talking about systemic issues. And I think that is, for not just as a person of color, but also as a sociologist, and I tend to see a lot of the weight needing to be placed there. So that's one tangible thing that, okay, I don't need, me personally, some other people will value different things, right? So I can't speak for everyone. If they rename the street I live on after a Mexican American, maybe I'll smile for the afternoon, right? But I need some systemic reform. That when I teach, social science, and I can show you, okay, applying for mortgages, people who have the exact same credit history, the exact same criminal background, the exact same income, you control statistically for all of that, and you still see that there's a rank ordering in who gets declined for a mortgage, who gets a loan, where do people go to the best schools, who gets the callback, and it's white, followed by Asian, followed by Hispanics, followed by blacks, right? Right. So that's something systemic. And what I appreciate about the Black Lives Matter movement, even if in some of these books or arguments we don't appreciate things, is like you hear the new Jim Crow as a kind of household term in Black families, right? When this was not a book that everyone read. That when I was teaching at Baylor, that a Republican senator came and spoke to us and used the term the new Jim Crow while talking to us about systemic inequality, not coming out pro or con on his solutions, but the fact that it was very odd to hear a Republican senator on stage in Texas talking about the new Jim Crow. So like, while these systemic issues are a part of the public conversation, I think it's something that all of us can take advantage of, that these are tangible solutions that, in my opinion, were not always offered. I think it's not just symbolic value at this point, not that there's no value in symbolic value, but ultimately if it doesn't end up in systemic change. And I hope that's something that the church will learn, will not be afraid of, but will embrace.
Thank you. Fernie, any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like just super quick, I think I completely agree. You know, there are so many systemic changes that need to happen in our country. And I think where we stand is that right now there is a Black Lives Matter movement that we need to join, right? And that that is the systemic change, and that it is systemic racism, systemic discrimination that needs to be addressed, and we need to be part of it, right? Because then there's going to be a time to where immigration policies and the discrimination Hispanics face, you know, and deportations is gonna have to get addressed. And at that point, I hope that our African American Black fellows can join us in speaking up and saying, okay, now is their turn. You know, they stood by our side. Now we're gonna stand by their side to ensure that all of these other issues are addressed, and that you know, by God's grace, we really are able to live in a society to where we are able to have these conversations. You know, like we are have a different races represented here, different backgrounds, and we're able to have a good and respectful conversation about what this means for each of us. And that's how the church needs to look, and that's you know, what hopefully our world looks like. But I know that's how heaven looks. So that's why we need to be here.
Very, very well said. And I think, and this kind of is a good pivot to I think not a next area, but a continuation of this is, you know, one of the things that we've had people, even some pushback internally within our church or within the church, you know, capital C, big picture church, say, why are we having these conversations in our church? I had someone say, well, I don't know of any issues within our church. People seem to kind of get along and love each other and care. And why are we kind of bringing this up? And so I think it would be good. You started to talk about that, Kenneth, about why, and I'd love to hear some more expansion on why it's important that we have these conversations and lead the way in these areas. But also, I guess, as a pastor, one of the things that's important to me is that I think, as you guys brought up, hey, the systemic change that we need is important. Let's not lose sight of that. I would also say, and not that it's, again, I think it's important to you too, but I think it's important for us to say in the conversation, as Christians, the bedrock of what should inspire and catapult us forward is the foundation of Scripture, and say, what does God speak to who we are, our identity, and then our calling and purpose in this world and what we're supposed to do. And, you know, there are things, good change, like you mentioned, you know, the new Jim Crow, and like, hey, I would hope, and I would believe, by the way, that everyone in our church and hearing this would say, man, if someone applies for a mortgage, then race shouldn't be a factor. You look at credit scores, you look at job history, you look at all those things, right? That's fair game, but that shouldn't be the case, or that type of discrimination. And so how do we figure out systemic ways to address those and lots of other challenges? And I also want to acknowledge, because I know this comes up a lot, that sometimes there are folks that ally and partner with Christians that hold some views that are contrary to Christian. I think we just have to acknowledge that there are some views that we could partner with somebody on an issue, and it doesn't mean we agree with them about every single issue, and it doesn't mean we should compromise as Christians and adopt certain issues just because we can partner on one position. And I think that's important to recognize. And I think with Calvary Fellowship, we've supported, we've given money, we've given volunteer time to certain organizations to push and advance a certain cause, like whether it's homelessness or hunger. It doesn't mean we part and parcel support every single function or thing that they do. I'd like to hear from you guys some pushback or feedback or comment on that, and your thoughts on that, and then we can maybe get into the broader issue of where does this all fit in, and why do we have these conversations in the church? And again, Kenneth, you brought some of that up already.
I guess, like, just kind of starting with the whole aspect of why do we as a church need to have these conversations. And I think it's because sin is ingrained in us, right? And we live in a culture that we are exposed to this, and we need to be able to come before God and as a church recognize the areas of sin in which we you know, are racist, and in which we put like, I can't say prejudgments on other people, you know. But I think kind of the what keeps coming to me in my mind is in James, when the Bible talks about that we do not show favoritism, you know, because when we're showing favoritism, we are in sin, you know. And I think sometimes as a church we can be blind to our favoritism toward different races and our favoritism towards different social statuses, and unless, you know, God isn't able to work, like he is able to work in our hearts, but we need to have these conversations and recognize that that is an area of sin within our individual selves, but also within the church. So we can be the light to the world that God's called us to be, and that we can go out there, you know, and shine light on these issues. I think so many times people that don't belong to the church will point fingers and say, well, the church is racist, and the church, you know, it's only this white church, that black church, that Hispanic church, and you'll never see them coming together. You know, we as Calvary Fellowship have the privilege and the beauty that we have a very diverse church, but that is not the experience for all the churches. So I think, you know, we are called to not be a stumbling block to the world. And this is, I think, an area where as a church, we are being a stumbling block to the world, which is why as a church, we need to have a conversation about it.
Yeah, and I'd like to add on to that. I agree wholeheartedly with everything I hear, and you know, kind of combining these questions: why should the church be talking about this? Why systemic racism? And what comes to mind is a response from some Christians, and it's not exclusive to Christians certainly, but well, this particular framing might be, but the issue of denying systemic racism is not exclusive to Christians, and there are a lot of Christians who don't deny that. That's why we're here right now. And we have a rich tradition here. But I have heard from some Christians, well, hold on, in response to the issue of systemic racism, this is a sin issue, as if those are opposite concepts, right? And I think what they mean is we need to deal with the individual sin in ourselves. And absolutely, if you hold race prejudices, if you are racist and you're showing favoritism, you are guilty of sin that you need to repent of. But I don't see any reason why biblically, and I don't believe that people actually believe this, as we talked about this privately, but biblically, okay, now we see that God judges nations, okay, and he recognizes the individual, he recognizes what we could call the community, the institution, whatever, the government, the state, right? So this is not me prophetically saying God is judging us or going to judge us, right? It's just to illustrate a biblical principle. Okay, so you have Sodom and Gomorrah, where God recognizes the sin of the city, but also I will search the individual hearts of the people as well when issuing that. But you also have Jesus talking about, you know, the judgment upon this place versus that place. And I don't think this is contingent upon literally every single soul being guilty of a certain sin there. You see Jesus in Revelations issuing, you know, condemnation of sins at the church here, at the church there, at the church there. Again, I'm not under the impression that this is predicated on literally 100% of the people being guilty of, you know, having this particular sin or that particular sin, that this is something we can recognize biblically. And I do think that Christians are capable of recognizing this in areas where we don't have blind spots. I have blind spots too, right? I'm not saying that as their problem over there and not mine. But for example, I like to use the example of China, okay? The Chinese government, I used to live in China, my wife is from China, the Chinese government adopts a philosophy of state atheism. Many Christians in the US are aware that this results in persecution against Christians in China. And yes, there are Christians in the government, there are reform, not very strong, but there are efforts for reform in the government. There are people in the government who don't agree with this. There are local governments who don't who don't enact the persecution. At the same time, in the same circles where you would hear resistance to systemic racism in the United States as an issue the church would address, you would also often hear the rightful recognition that the Chinese government is acting in an evil way, right? That is systemic language. You will recognize that State atheism and opposition, the militancy of that has been institutionalized in the Chinese government, that there is a problem in the government beyond just the individuals who hate Christians there, right? That is really easy for us to recognize. When we talk about a political party that we don't like, or some organization that involved in the culture wars that we don't like, usually we don't have a problem describing them as committing an evil, as committing a sin collectively, right? We don't have a problem with that. And so I would just encourage people to search your heart. Is there a blind spot here that maybe makes it difficult to acknowledge here? I think there's a biblical precedent for this, and the church is, we're called to to seek justice, right? As you walk humbly with God. So be humble about it, but also seek justice. And I think there's a biblical justification for that institutionally and individually in the hearts of people. And then finally, I would say, why in the church? Because I think we are called to call out sin amongst our midst first. But I think we do have an opportunity and a call to speak to the larger culture as well. I mean, we live in one of the more secular parts of the country. We certainly have racism issues here. Actually, Connecticut has one of the highest inequality scores in the country. I don't want to step on toes here, but just compare that. And this is not anything I've heard of the church, but we know the ethos in New England. Go look at the Gini coefficient. That is the standard measure for inequality, and compare that to some of the southern states that we're proud of not being. You may see some surprise answers there. You'll see some surprise answers with kind of the de facto segregation measures that we look at as well. And so I think this is an opportunity for the church to speak out into the broader culture, witness and to transform, and as we are called to do biblically.
It's good. Jalith, were you
Yes, please.
want to jump in? Yeah.
So first of all of the claps for all of the things that both of you have said so far. I didn't want to be as distracting. I was going to have my reactions going a lot, but I didn't know if that was okay. So they're going to come back because I saw Fernie do one. So, but that said, why have these conversations in the church, and why let the church or make the church be part of this moment? The people in the church are suffering, right? Like, people who go to your church are experiencing the world outside of your church, and they need to be cared for, right? And so at a very basic level, like 101, this is a form of care to people in our church, right? To see them, to hear them, to acknowledge their experiences, and to let them know that God sees them, God hears them, God still loves them, and to help them not like lose faith or lose hope. I really double, triple, quadruple clap on the, not wanting the church to be a stumbling block for people. The church has a really dark history as it relates to racism, right? And it's unfortunate, but it becomes part of our responsibility as Christians to make sure that it's not repeated, right? Part of the value of knowing history is to not repeat some of the mistakes and the atrocities of it, right? And so that's another thing. The other, I guess, caution I would say is like just having a sense of the other. If you walk into the four walls of your church and there's nothing wrong for you, that's great. That's awesome, and I'm glad. But for somebody else, something else is happening, and for them to voice that and to, ask their church to be part of the solution to healing that is okay, because it's no more your church than it is theirs, right? And so it's a fair role for the church. And then the other thing, like, is just, could you, I guess this falls under sense of other again, but as Fernie was talking about, English being a second language, the first thing I thought of is how English has been used as a tool to other non-native English speakers who are in fact American still, right? Like, where some other languages their first language, but they are American, and how that's used to like make them feel like they're not really American and othering them. And then it smacked me like, oh my gosh, how does that feel in a church setting? Like, how how would I feel if when I was worshiping, right, like I didn't really understand what I was saying, um, and like how am I really focusing, right? Because worship isn't just about like, getting excited or anything like that. It's about focusing, right? And turning your hearts and your minds to the Lord, right? And to understand like who He is, what He's done, what He's going to continue to do, and why He's worthy of your praise. Like what is that like if you never worship in your native tongue, right? But you're with your family, like you, right? I think about Stephen and your cousin-in-law, I think, um, in those types of situations, right? So I think the church, in short, has a very, you know, big responsibility, actually, like it's imperative. And if you also believe that God will change and heal the world through the church, and you see racism as a sin, it's a no-brainer to me that the church would have to be involved in this, right? Like as leaders. So I think that was a great question. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up, because like I know that like that is something for me that's always kind of in the back of my mind, right? And like to where, especially in Connecticut, we have a very large Spanish speaking population, and kind of what a service it would be for them to have, and for us, because I understand both languages great, but I miss like sermons in Spanish. That's what I grew up with. That's like where I learned my memory verses, and just even speaking of like what a blessing it would be to our church and our community to have Spanish speaking services or worships. I know sometimes there's, and not that we are gonna like start the, just going around and like trying to get this started, but just a thought, like I know sometimes churches will have headphones to where someone's interpreting for them the sermon, to give access to more people, because I know this is something that for me is always, just in my heart, because my mom doesn't really speak English, and there's times to where I hear like these sermons and that I know would like benefit her and that would speak to her heart, or I read these blogs that are just about women diving in the word, and I'm like, like I want to send it to her, but for me to send it, I would have to first sit and translate it and then like send it to her. So I'm just kind of gonna just skim, and it's just not the same to be served in your native language, than in a different one where you may not really impact. And I think just the importance of gospel-centered service that also reaches across the language barriers and the nations. I know for me, one of my favorite songs is like Chris Tomlin, the song where like everyone's singing in different languages. I'm bad with names. How great is our God, right? And like how great is our God singing in different languages. And when I hear that song, and it refreshes my soul, because I'm reminded that that's what heaven's going to look like, and kind of what is our role as a church to bring heaven to earth, and that way, share the good news of the gospel, bring the unity of the gospel to our churches and to the world.
And I love that. I love the broader conversation we had with you, Kenneth, and Fernie, and also Jalith, your comments. And this is why conversations need to happen. For example, you kind of brought up at the end of your thoughts, Jalith, this idea of othersness and the idea of language. Well, that's a whole nother point, because and people could fairly say, well, okay, Spanish is one language, but there's many other languages, and why not Chinese and Mandarin? How about Cantonese? How about and what's the practical need? And so this is where you have prayer and consider what God is doing for your church, and remembering that one church can't serve every single people group. That's why there are sometimes different churches that focus around ethnicities, because there is a cultural connection there. But sometimes a church is called to, for example, when we launched our deaf and hard of hearing ministry, well, that is a language. Signing is a language. And so it was to try to build a bridge to that people group. And it started with a passion of people were coming that were disconnected, and how can we minister to them, and we've tried to grow that. So I'll just throw this out there as because so we can kind of stay focused for today, but this is a great thought. If any of you feel like that burden and you think like, hey, I would love to, if I have Spanish speaking friends that would come if we had some connections, well, would you be willing to interpret? What does that look like? And and again, this is a conversation and a prayer for another day, but I love that we, through conversations like this, can lead to other conversations that we could have to build a bridge. And back to the point about stepping back to addressing race, racism, and injustice in our churches, and why, and the idea of it being a stumbling block for people, and the church, capital C's, history of complicity, unfortunately, many times in these injustices, and people looking on. I'm reminded of in the book of Acts, when Paul, a Jew, started ministering to non-Jews and bringing them to Jesus and the Greeks and whoever it was that he was bringing. And then there was a group of Jewish people that tried to bring their cultural Judaism and their religious background into Christianity. And they said, well, you're not a Christian unless you get circumcised. So imagine doing an altar call today at our church. Hey, by the way, you just need to accept Jesus and perform this minor outpatient procedure, right? That creates a huge stumbling block for people. And so Paul advocated, went to the church council and said, look, here's the problem and here's the issue. And so what did the church leaders early on say? In our judgment, we shouldn't make it hard for the Gentiles to come to Jesus. So they removed that stumbling block and then put some basic commonalities in place. And I think that's our call as Christians. We shouldn't make it hard for people to come to Jesus. And so if there are stumbling blocks, then we've got to deal with them, even if we may not like it. And so to sum up now from there, what I've heard from all of you, and you know, I'm a preacher, I like alliteration, so some of this is going to be a little bit of alliteration, is the first thing that I heard from you guys is reflection. We need to have some awareness in our hearts or in our churches, or where have we had a blind spot to some racism or some things that we haven't been seeing right. And by the way, no ethnicity has this exactly right. No group has it exactly right. Even as we're talking about reforms, it's possible to overstep, overcorrect, and there's a tension of having, that's why you have to have healthy conversations to address these things, but reflection and then repentance. If God brings to your attention where you're off and shows you a blind spot, you know, repentance, changing your mind, changing the way you think and moving in his direction. And that's, again, individually, but corporately. And then from there is the idea of reconciliation. And I think we have to be reconciled amongst one another. And we've talked about that and work together with Jesus so that we can then go out and represent to the world. And that's the idea of John 17. God, make them one as we are one. And when we are one, when we're really one, not just singing together, although that's part of it, but when we are one as a people, the world will look on, because the world looks on at all these issues and in a lot of ways feels no hope. There's a sense of, oh, this is the moment, this is that, but there's also a hopelessness. Like, are we ever going to really address these things? But if the world, it looks on, and I think it's Jesus' vision to see the church coming together and doing these things, then it goes back to what you were saying, Kenneth, about a great opportunity to share the gospel. I love what you said. Yeah, God help me be more effective. How come no one wants to know about why I should follow Jesus today? Well, we have an issue in front of us. And for all those reasons, including the proclamation of the gospel, the life-changing thing, because when this whole world blows apart, there's a whole eternity afterwards. And ultimately, we want people to know Jesus. But how we live now is going to impact how we do that. So that's my summary of some of what you said. And I hope I didn't put any words in your mouth or to distill that down. But what I'd like to do from you guys now is any final thoughts, and then I want to kind of end where we normally do with sort of maybe a key redemptive thought for the day and what you might encourage or challenge us at Calvary Fellowship or anyone else that might be listening to consider today. So before we get to that sort of closing redemptive thought, any other things that you had on the tip of your tongue and you're like, oh man, it got away from me, but I need to say this? Going once. All right. So how about, Jalith, I'll put you on the spot first. What's a redemptive thought that you can kind of share? A quick takeaway that maybe Scott's put on your heart, something for us to consider to walk away with in a redemptive way today.
I think the thing that is like at the forefront of my mind is just that we're in this together. I know it's the phrase that we've heard a lot, being in a, a health pandemic as well, like the coronavirus and all that. But I would just encourage my brothers and sisters of color, regardless of ethnicity, to really look at this as being in this together, and not, you know, and as a false dichotomy of, it's our turn or their turn or whatever, but, looking at this as like overall, what Kenneth said earlier in quoting Dr. King is like an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so by me helping my brother and sister in this area, I'm also preserving myself in this other area. It's a little selfish to look at it that way, but it kind of is what it is. And also just, we should just really be focusing on like loving one another too. And if that means that like my hurt needs to be addressed, or her hurt needs to be addressed, or his hurt needs to be addressed, like because you love them, you do. Like it's very simple to me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jalitha. I appreciate that. Fernie, how about you? A redemptive thought to leave us with today.
I think I'm just grateful that in the midst of all of this, like God is working in our hearts, right? And we are having these conversations, and He is allowing us to go through these hard times. And hopefully, this just brings redemption. This is called redemption to our lives, to our generations, and that He can be praised. So I guess that's just for me, that hope that this work is worth doing and these conversations are worth having because eternity is at stake.
Amen. Thank you, Fernie. And how about you, Kenneth?
Yeah, so I had one last tip of my tongue thought, and it happened to be a redemptive thought, so I'm saving it for now.
Awesome.
So I appreciated very much, Jalith bringing up earlier that, yes, minorities in the church, marginalized people in the church, we do have a right to, ask of this of our churches, ask for healing, right? In the same way we expect anything else, that we, at Calvary, we set up a COVID relief fund because, of course, the church is going to be where people turn during times like these, and that this is no different. And the good news is we're here. If you look, I look at, as a social scientist studying religion, evangelical churches are still diversifying, while other churches that maybe talk a bit more about this sort of topic are still some of the widest spaces in the country and are not diversifying, and we're not diversifying as much as we should, but it is happening. And you see statistically that whites are secularizing a bit quickly compared to other groups, while there's revival happening among communities of color, particularly in the Latin American communities. And not that I want secularization to happen anywhere, but we're here. And I remember my first couple of weeks in Connecticut, I was bombarded with, and it's toned down since, but I was bombarded with a series of from strangers. I'm not racist, but statements. And that statement in the history of life has never ended in something non-racist, by the way. And there was a sense of relief when I got to the church, and I looked around, and not that we don't have diversity goals for the future, but I looked around and I was like, compared to what I've been experiencing, it looks like a college brochure here, except they didn't have to reach to get everyone for the college brochure. I've been in a college brochure before. And so there was an incredible amount of diversity. The people are here asking for help, and I think it should be on the heart of every Christian to say, how can I serve? How can I help? Who's in need of this gospel? Who's in need of this redemption, of this liberation, of this healing, right? Who's in need of it? And we've got people knocking on the door asking. We've got people flocking to us as a church, and we've got a culture ready to listen. And I think both for the sake of the gospel and for the sake of national healing and lots of people recovering, I think conditions are, I don't want to say couldn't be better because we could blow it, but we've got the opportunity, and and if we don't take it, it's on us. But if we do take it, I think God's going to work very powerfully.
I think that's so well said. And I guess what I would say to everyone that's listening to this, my fellow white brothers and sisters, but all ethnicities, let's not get fatigued and wait for the moment to pass. Let's leverage the moment and say, Jesus, what do you want to do? Because you look in the Bible and you're like, oh, we might idealize or romanticize a certain time in Scripture. If you study the Bible, it was screwed up in every season. There's always problems. Like, it's a whole history, and yet it's God's work in a nation or a group of people or an individual in a time of chaos. And so let's not miss this. And I would just add, my final thought is from Acts 10:34 and 35. Peter, after kind of God did a work in him about favoritism, and this is, he says, I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right. And so we're in Proverbs right now, and we're talking about the fear of the Lord. That just means considering him in the way that we think, live, act, feel. And so when it comes to race, ethnicity, racism, we need to fear God, and we need to recognize he doesn't show favoritism. You know, he's not looking down at one nation, people group above the other. He wants to elevate everybody and ultimately have him be elevated through this process. And so recognizing that, and just what does that look like for us to fear him? And then notice it says, and do what is right. So we're having conversations that hopefully lead us to change and that translate into actions in our lives. So the question is, where do we need to fear God in these issues and open ourselves to blind spots? And then where do we need to act, whatever that looks like, as the Holy Spirit speaks to you and speaks to us as a church? So first of all, thank you so much, Kenneth. Thank you for Fernie. You guys brought a lot of wisdom to the table today, and my co-host Jalith, as always, on point and bringing lots of good things for us to consider. So thankful for you. And I'm thankful for you who watched this today, whether you're checking it out on Facebook Live, YouTube, or wherever else you're checking it out. I also want to encourage you, would you go ahead and take a moment and like this? Would you share it and pass it on to other people? Because there are people that need to engage in this conversation, and you have the opportunity to pass that on to them. So thank you so much for checking this out today, and we'll look forward to seeing you on another edition of Race and Redemption soon.